Hey everyone, welcome back to our YouTube channel. Thanks so much for being here today. I'm Rachel.
And I'm Jessica. We are the Certified Occupational Therapy Assistants with Harkla, and today we are going to talk about how to know if your OT is right for you.
This was actually a question we got from a fellow YouTube watcher. Is that the right term? A YouTube watcher?
Sure.
From someone who was watching a YouTube video, left a comment and said, hey, how do I know if my OT is the right fit for me? And while you think just off the top of your head, well, it should be a no-brainer, right? It's a little bit more complicated than that, and we are going to break it down and help you figure out what you should be looking for, what you should be getting out of OT, and how to advocate for yourself and for your child's needs.
Quick side note, anytime during this video when we say OT, we're referring to an occupational therapist. And if we say COTA, we're referring to a certified occupational therapy assistant. There are some differences between these two. So an OT is the person who you go to and you do the initial evaluation with. They create the treatment plan and the treatment goals. Now, OTs can oftentimes still do the regular daily treatment sessions as well, where a COTA is the one who only does treatment sessions. They're not typically involved in the initial evaluation and goal writing, but they follow the treatment plan and the goals and create those daily sessions. So a little bit of difference. They're both great. They both can, have great positive impacts with your child. But just so you know, there's a little bit of a difference. Those are the abbreviations we use throughout the video.
As a parent, going into a clinic or having a therapist come into your home can be very overwhelming and very daunting, and making sure that it's the right fit is very important for a variety of reasons. You want your child to make progress. You want yourself to feel empowered. You want to be able to ask questions openly and not feel awkward, and you just want to be able to have a positive relationship with this person.
Yeah, so the first thing that you want to make sure that you're doing to see if it's a right fit or not is to trust your gut. So how do you feel when you interact with the therapist? What does it look like when the therapist is interacting with your child? Do you get a good feeling when you see that interaction, when you hear about the interaction? Or is, like what Rachel said, is it awkward or uncomfortable? Or do you feel like the therapist isn't taking your feedback or answering your questions? Ultimately, you want to trust your gut on how you feel about this person and go with that.
The second thing to look for is what additional training has your therapist completed. If you're going into the clinic or if they're coming into your house to help you with the child's sensory processing, do they have advanced training or experience in the areas of sensory processing? If you're interested in learning more about their primitive reflexes and getting their reflexes assessed, does the therapist have training in reflexes? Do they believe in them? Have they taken time to look at the research? So being aware of what the therapist certifications are, do they have additional training in handwriting? Do they have an additional training in any area that you are struggling with and you want help with your child? Maybe you don't know what certifications there are, but you could always ask them and say, hey, what training do you have? Do you have any certifications? What are you gonna do good? No, I'm just kidding. Don't say that. But you know what we're saying. Just make sure that you have that open conversation and make sure that the therapist knows that you do have high expectations of what they're going to accomplish for your child and with you.
I will say I've had this happen to me personally in the clinic where I got a new kiddo on my caseload, and the first day that they came in for their session, I met them and the parent immediately asked me, hey, are you trained in primitive reflex integration? And at the time, luckily, I was already. I had already taken several courses on it and had been working with kids on this specific area. So I was able to tell them that, yeah, I do. Here's what I've done. Here's what I've learned. Here's how I'm going to help you and your child. But also, if I hadn't been, that would have been a great moment for me to say, you know what, I'm actually not, but if that's what you want to work on with your child, then I can definitely look into getting trained in that area. And that's a great opportunity for therapists as well to grow and learn more based on their clients' needs.
Ideally, if you ask this question to a therapist and they say no, you want an answer like Jessica had. You want someone who is open to learn more. If they shut you down and say, for example, we're talking about primitive reflexes, no, primitive reflexes don't matter, they're not going to make a difference, then that's a very closed-minded professional. And you want to ask yourself, well, if they're closed-minded about that, what else are they going to be closed-minded about? So chatting with a therapist and making sure that they are open to acquiring more learning if that's what it takes to help your child thrive.
The third thing to look at is what equipment does the clinic have? This, of course, doesn't necessarily apply if the therapist is coming into your home, but if you and your child are going to an outpatient clinic setting, what type of equipment does that therapy clinic have? Do they have a variety of suspended pieces of equipment, different swings, different climbing items? Do they have a variety of balance objects, balance beams, balance buckets? What do they have that they're going to be able to use to help provide your child with a variety of experiences?
We're not saying these clinics that you're going to have to be the bougiest or the fanciest clinics ever, but you do want to make sure that they have a variety of equipment in order to help your child meet their needs. Jessica and I did therapy in a church.
With no equipment.
We walked in for a year, I think, before we had a
Almost
clinic with a suitcase of equipment, and we could fit what we could fit. We had to get really creative, but thankfully our parents that we were working with were very gracious and understanding that this is what we're doing. It's a very rural area. There aren't a lot of other options, so we're going to make do with what we have. And you know what? That was some of my favorite times treating kiddos was when we didn't have anything and we had to be creative and think outside of the box.
I was going to say it definitely made us better therapists because we had to find more unique ways to provide similar sensory experiences for our clients. So if you are going to a clinic and they don't have a lot of sensory equipment, maybe they have 1 or 2 or 3 things, you can always ask the therapist and say, hey, my child really struggles with vestibular processing. I see you have 1 swing available. What other ways are you going to work on my child's ability to process vestibular input? And hopefully that therapist can provide you with some maybe unique or out-of-the-box ideas of how they're going to help, but how also you can do it at home if you don't have the equipment.
And you know what? It's okay to put your therapist on the spot and ask them those questions. You are hiring the therapist to work with your child. You have the opportunity to ask them those questions and make them feel not necessarily uncomfortable, but make them feel that you are here to work and you are here to make progress.
The fourth thing to consider is if you've been in therapy for a little while and your child was interested and enjoyed it for a little while, but all of a sudden they hate going. And all of a sudden they put up a really big fight. They don't want to go, they're refusing, they're avoiding it. This could actually be a red flag that something with the OT isn't quite right. Now, it's important to remember that as therapists, our job is to push our clients, these kiddos, out of their comfort zone, push them to do hard things. So sometimes it might not be the most fun. Nobody likes doing hard things, especially our kiddos, right? They want things to be easy because that's just how our brains work. But our job as therapists is when we're pushing them to do these hard things to make it fun and motivating and build rapport with these kiddos so these kiddos ultimately enjoy coming to therapy. But if for some reason your child's not enjoying it and they say, nope, I hate therapy, I don't like it, then that could be a sign that maybe something's not working right with the interaction between your therapist and your child.
If you're still not quite sure how things are jiving, you can always ask to sit in on a therapy session with your therapist and your child and maybe peek in from afar, maybe sit in the corner and watch. Sometimes it can be more challenging for kids to have their parents or caregivers in the room with them, so that you might have to get creative with this one, but at least you know, the therapist knows that this is something that you want to learn, you want to explore, you want to check out, however you want to word it, just make it positive, and you don't want to make the therapist feel necessarily like you're watching them and you're watching them to mess up. Like, that's never our intention at all, and we don't want you to make the therapist feel that way either. So sit in on a session, learn some things, and see how it's going.
Yeah, ultimately, if the interactions between the therapist and your child aren't going well, bring it up with the therapist and let them know your concern and see if you can find a solution.
The fifth thing to consider is, do they take your comments, your questions, your concerns, the areas that you're struggling with for your child, do they take those into consideration when they're writing the treatment plan or the goals? Or are they goals that don't really make sense to the areas that you are struggling with? Maybe you aren't sure what the goals exactly mean, something to ask them about and bring it up. But make sure that if your child is struggling with getting dressed, eating their breakfast, sitting down at the table without getting up, those types of things, make sure that those are written into the treatment plan so that way you know that the therapist is actually working on these things that you're struggling with at home, because that is why OT in person is so beneficial.
I think it's also good to remember too that you can ask your therapist questions and say, hey, this was our struggle. I know this is in our treatment plan. How are you working on this in the session? And hopefully the therapist can give you an idea and say, we're working on toothbrushing by addressing the underlying skills with X, Y, and Z. And then also, if the therapist is giving you a home exercise program, that is a green flag for sure.
Mm-hmm. If you don't know what a home exercise program is, it's basically homework that you need to do outside of therapy. Therapy is great going once or twice a week, but we still have the rest of the time to be working on these skills that they're doing in therapy. So if they're not giving you sensory strategies, if they're not giving you tools to do at home, activities to work on, make sure that you advocate and you ask for those things, because the best way to make progress is to be consistent with these things that they're doing in therapy. And the only way to be consistent with doing these things is by doing them at home.
Last thing to note, Rachel already said this once, but it's worth repeating.
We're very passionate about this topic, can you tell?
Remember that you are hiring this therapist, the OT or the COTA. You are in charge and you are your child's best advocate. So make sure that you aren't afraid to speak up. Yes, the OT or COTA are the professional here, but you are your child's best advocate. So you need to make sure you're standing up, advocating for them, asking questions, and making sure it's a right fit for you.
Another thing to keep in mind is if you are going to an in-person therapy clinic and maybe they're recommending virtual services where you have the opportunity to actually go in person, make sure that you are going into the clinic rather than doing the virtual therapy, because where virtual therapy is so helpful for those instances where you're not able to go in-person therapy in the clinic is always going to be the number one option. In most cases. I will say there are some cases where virtual therapy is better for some children, but try to advocate for that in-person one-on-one therapy as often as you can.
If you liked this video, if it was helpful, if you enjoyed it, make sure you share it with somebody else that could benefit from it. Like this video, comment with your thoughts, subscribe to our YouTube channel, all the things.
Yep. If you want more resources, you can follow our podcast. We do release a new podcast episode every Wednesday on all podcast platforms. We're here to share the real, the raw, sensory, unfiltered today, apparently, with all of our excitement on this topic. So thank you for hanging out with us, and we'll see you next week. This was actually...
I don't think I was going to.
Okay.
A little bit of...
Wait. Whoa, that was deep. You're right, I'm not supposed to apologize for being myself.
That's what you say, sorry, not sorry.
Sorry, I'm actually not sorry.